Welcome to the Grow Renaissance podcast. Let's nourish the world.
Welcome everybody to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. I'm excited about this one. I have been getting Andy set up and teed up for this for a couple of months now. So today we have my good friend, active Grow blockchain node owner, Andy Jenkins on the phone. We have had really an amazing journey over the last year, getting to know each other, getting to understand how blockchain works and the different use cases and ways that we can bring it to the world in this Grow Renaissance that we're building as a community. So welcome, Andy. Thank you for being here. Can you give us, all of the listeners out there, a little bit of background on who you are and how we got to this episode?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Will. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. And hopefully we haven't set the wrong expectation saying that it took us 2 months to get ready for this, but it's great to be here so much.
Well, we've been busy. To be granted, I went to Switzerland and then Europe, which we've been in Switzerland together. We spent it's not because we didn't want to, it's because we've been busy.
That's right. I appreciate that. Yeah, Andy Jenkins. I live in Utah and first came in contact with Will and Rhett and Wright about a year ago, and started to kind of share some ideas of things that we were focused on and doing, and realized that there was a lot of synergy between some of the initiatives that we were kind of trying to drive, and a lot of overlap with what Grow was focused on and doing. And so my background, lived around the world in a company that do kind of IT, technical outsourcing consulting work. And once we kind of finished with that company, started getting focused on the renewable energy space, the carbon space, and kind of climate change initiatives. And that's where my paths first crossed with Will, Wright, and Rhett, and started to learn a lot more about what was going on with Grow. Became very interested in the initiatives that Grow was driving.
Love it. I'm gonna go back into your background because you glossed over a lot of things. Andy has done some really amazing things. Lived in Switzerland for like 8 years. But one of the things that I love about Andy, before we got, is he actually owns a restaurant, and he owns a restaurant. If you're ever in Midway, make sure you go see Café Galleria because it's amazing food. But before we get into the sustainability, if it's all right with you, I want to talk about why you got into the restaurant and some really cool things that we're looking at with food on the restaurant side.
Yeah, sure. So living in a small town here in Midway, up in kind of the backside of the Wasp, I'm intrigued with the ability to run a restaurant that had kind of a focus on sustainability, kind of more focus on where the food was being sourced from, the type of food that was being used for our consumers. And so we started purchased a restaurant and then kind of started to transform a restaurant called Café Galleria with a real strong goal towards trying to form kind of the whole supply chain of food and be more focused on kind of where that food is sourced and then how it's presented to the consumers. And so when Grow started to kind of talk about their big picture ambitions of feeding and nourishing the world, kind of struck a chord with me, kind of in the same kind of context of what we were trying to do and focused on with our little restaurant, and figuring out ways you can kind of more directly source your food products, get more fresh items into the food supply of the restaurant, as well as kind of have just more awareness of what's going into the production of those foods that are being served to our customers.
Love it. The thing that excites me about that story, and particularly in this episode, is you understand a lot of the ways in which we are looking at nourishing the world. Because if you take the vision of Grow, it's to nourish the world in every single way possible. And today we're going to talk about the food supply chain, from getting it to us as consumers, but also in the restaurant space. And it's really cool to see that we're seeing restaurants like Café Galleria be much more involved in, we want to know where our food comes from. We want to be as locally sourced as possible. We want our end consumer to know, and they're starting to want to know. So I just want to make sure we talk about it and give everybody a shout out that's in Utah or ever there, that they need to make sure and stop by, because it will be one of the first quote unquote Grow restaurants in the world that has jumped in with the initiatives that we have. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I think so. And part of that journey that makes it kind of particularly challenging is it's one thing to kind of source seasonal items, kind of more farmers market type items, kind of in the summer or the late summer. What becomes harder as a restaurant owner is consistently sourcing products that you can have on your menu year round, that you can have a story that's built around that kind of becomes part of the essence of the restaurant itself. And so sourcing fresh tomatoes in August is quite easy, but sourcing beef products year round that have a lot of traceability and trackability of where they came from, who was growing them, what went into growing them, and all of that kind of component becomes a much more challenging aspect of running a restaurant where we're doing the types of things that we're talking about here.
Yes, exactly. Amazing. And we're going to help solve those problems. And it's big problems. I think one of the things that I talk a little bit about on this show is the problems that we're looking to solve are not going to be solved in the next 6 months or the next 3 quarters of work. They're big problems. And the reason that we have the structure that we have and as a community is that's what moves that big problem forward, and finding solutions as a community, because they exist and they're fairly large and they're not going to be solved overnight, but we're on the path and kind of living by the belief that the more people, the better. 5 minds is better than one, and we're getting a lot of minds plugged into our community and what we're doing. So it's really, really cool to see what we're doing on the restaurant side. I'm going to shift us back. I just wanted to make sure we went there into really getting into sustainability and all of the things that you're involved in. And so when we first met, you were at the kind of genesis of being involved in a company called Trifera, who with the Grow blockchain has now partnered with for use of their technology with drone footage and satellite footage to basically map things that are happening in the real world. And so can you give us maybe a little bit deeper in that of what Trifera is actually doing and why you decided to get involved with them even before you met us?
Yeah. So Trifera started by a couple of very dear friends of mine, Jonathan and Caroline, who live in London. They've both been friends of mine and in my life in various capacities for the last 15 or 20 years. Caroline and I worked together throughout Europe and around the world in previous kind of engagements where we were both working for the same company. And as our friendship kind of grew and we spent more and more time together, I was part of some very early some of the ideas and the concepts of what Trifera would have been, why Trifera would be relevant, why the capabilities that they were trying to create with Trifera would be unique to the market, things that didn't exist today. Both Jonathan and Caroline come at it from a deep banking, regulatory, kind of statutory mindset. Caroline comes at it from a very commercial minded focus, having put together very large outsourcing transactions and consulting transactions, IT transactions for some of the largest companies in the world. She kind of understands what makes things tick in kind of corporate America. Jonathan understands what makes things safe and secure in banking land, as he calls it. And so they had this unique vision of how they could bring to bear technology using at scale very large AI technology to assess things around the world using satellite imagery, ground truth data, drone data, and bring all of that to bear in a technology platform that could help landowners, farmers, ranchers, companies that are focused on supply chains, companies that are focused on ensuring that products are grown sustainably or responsibly without the use of child labor. And so the idea was hatched for Trifera a number of years ago, kind of in the living room of Jonathan and Caroline's house in London. And once I realized that they were serious about it and they were going to really take their vision and put it out into the market, I knew I wanted to be involved. And so I've had kind of various advisory and supporting roles, helping them develop and build their company since the beginning. And it's been a terrific journey. I was happy to introduce Trifera to Grow very early on, coming out of the very first discussions I had with you, Will, and Rhett. I started to talk about this opportunity to create carbon assets and to create the ability to monitor and track and trace food in various ways. And that kind of became the start of what I think is an amazing relationship that's developed between Grow and Treefera.
It's been amazing, and for everyone listening, we are going to get both Jonathan and Caroline on a podcast episode to tell their deep story. And if you're on our YouTube channel, there's actually a video. We did a community call with Jonathan and Caroline that is on one of our channels there, so you can go and find it. But they'll be coming in a later episode to talk specifically about that story. But that, bringing all of that together, we talk about tracking and tracing. And when I look at the blockchain utility, really all we're doing is we're taking actions that happen in the real world and we're tracking them in an immutable way on a digital blockchain. And the partnership with Treefera, because you're only as good as the data that you can put into that digital world. And Treefera becomes this piece that gets data significantly faster. We actually had a really cool meeting with a very large company last week, and they had taken about 18 months to do a process that we did in about 6 weeks using that technology, and the data matched up almost perfectly. And so it really comes in to show what can happen when you start bringing these amazing techs together. And you still need boots on the ground and companies to come in and make those actions happen. And so we have this piece with Treefera that you're involved in that can show what's happening. We have the blockchain to prove it, but something has to happen on the ground. And can you tell us now, as we get deeper and deeper, I told you guys the Andy story is deep in the things he's involved in, but now you go into Vertera and the company that you founded and run that actually has helped do some of that, and maybe speak specifically to the biochar projects that you're working on right now with us and some of our partners.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Will. So fortunately for me, very early on through the relationship with Will and Grow, I had the opportunity to get introduced to Austin, who I think is a frequent guest and a frequent component of this whole initiative and this renaissance that Will's driving. But I had the opportunity to go up and visit a number of different times with Austin and his family up in Washington. And one of the things that I became very impressed by and very aware of very early on was the importance of kind of soil in this entire story. And Austin, he's very focused as a farmer and a rancher and a dairy operator on soil and the importance of soil in this entire regenerative story. And one of the things that kind of came out of a lot of those discussions obviously was kind of doing things to kind of offset crediting and to create carbon credits. And in the course of doing that, there's ways that we can use biochar as a mechanism to not only create carbon credits, create offsets, but also take that biochar and embed it into a compost material that's created through the Soil Center, which is a subsidiary of the farm that Austin runs up at Royal Family Farms, and use that as a mechanism to further enhance and enrich the soil. And the way that it does that is biochar.
Before you get into how you do it, will you just tell the audience what biochar is? Because I think sometimes we talk about it a lot, but I remember the first time I heard biochar, I didn't really understand exactly what it is. So before you get into the mechanism, we kind of tell everybody what exactly is this biochar thing we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. So biochar essentially is taking biomass material, any form of bio waste, woody waste, anything that possesses carbon, and taking that carbon and locking it up in a state that becomes very similar to like a charcoal, and it becomes a very light, porousy material that would look and feel kind of almost like pre-ash out of a fire. And so it has kind of a light black kind of state that turns into basically secured carbon. And depending on kind of the process you use and how pure it is, it's basically sequestering carbon in that finite state for up to 1,000 years. Whereas if it wasn't locked into that state, it would continue to decompose and emit gases into the atmosphere. And so biochar simply just becomes kind of a fixed permanent state of carbon that then can be secured and locked into that state for hundreds and thousands of years and preserved in that kind of carbon form.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I kind of got you off the track of as you get into the soil side and the mechanism of how all of this works. So continue there.
Yeah. So what I started to realize is as Austin gets focused on soil, the health of the soil, the quality of the soil, the attributes of the soil, he has an ability to create a very special blend of soil that's a mixture of composted manure from the dairy combined with what he calls worm castings, which is kind of the byproduct of another carbon removal process, carbon avoidance process that he runs through the way that he manages his wet manure. And so he runs that through a very specific process where he's got a worm farm and he filters the wet manure down through wood chips filled with worms. The worms basically decompose all of that, which then prohibits the methane from being emitted into the atmosphere. And at the bottom of that process, you've got kind of a purified water that comes out from that worm farm. And the castings that get excreted from those worms are very nutrient dense, very beneficial to the soil. They add all kinds of different nutrients to the soil. And so what Austin's figured out how to do is take this composted blend of dry manure combined with a mixture of the worm castings from this worm farm operation that's also creating carbon credits. And then when you combine that with 10 to 15, 20% biochar, you get just this highly, highly unique, very powerful soil blend that not only has a number of different amazing attributes. Number one, it allows the soil to use less water. And so because of all of these different porous-like attributes, it retains water 20 or 30% more effectively than just natural soil. It also possesses the ability for the yields from the farm to increase 20, 30% because of all of this nutrient dense characteristic. But probably as important as anything, because of all of these characteristics, it allows the operation to avoid the use of artificial and synthetic fertilizers. So you can use kind of these natural processes, these natural gifts from sunlight and soil and regenerative processes from animals to create this soil blend that avoids the use of synthetics and then gets put back into the farm, allowing less water, higher yields, and just a better, more nutrient-dense product. So the way that we do that is we take woody waste material that's coming from the farm. One good example that we use is orchards that are growing apples or cherries or things that maybe the orchard has grown tired, or the species of the type of apple or the type of cherry that's being grown there is no longer kind of what the market desires. And so they've got to take and clear cut that orchard. Traditionally, what would happen is that would all just be burned, putting all of that waste out into the atmosphere. What we do is we take all of that orchard waste, all of that wood material, and we convert it. We convert all of that carbon that was created over those decades of that tree growing and photosynthesis in the sun. We take all that carbon and we transform it into a permanent fixed state, which is this biochar material. And then Austin ultimately takes that biochar, combines it with those other processes I described to create this perfect soil blend. And so in conjunction with Royal Family Farms and with the Soil Center, we started a new company focused on the creation of biochar that's now getting used across Royal Family Farms in a regenerative way to help all of the different farming operations and ranching operations that Austin and his team are running up in Washington.
It's amazing. Amazing. Thank you, Andy. Putting this in perspective to all of our listeners is what this creates is the most ideal circular regenerative system that's using all of the natural matter that already exists in a way that it circulates itself. And so when you talk about like just what's happening on Royal Family Farming, you have poop that used to sit in a lagoon and do nothing. In fact, just be filled with bacteria, is now getting sprayed, used as feed for these worms that just give worm castings. You have these orchards who used to just be cut down and mulched, who are now getting turned into biochar, put back into compost, and creating better feed for the soils and this regeneration system. And so one thing that I want to point out, because especially as we're in this space, there's a lot of talk around carbon, around the atmosphere. What are we really doing to nourish the atmosphere, and where does carbon play a role in that? And the thing that's been really incredible for me in the projects that we've worked on is when you look at the data of the soil health is better. And you mentioned this at the very beginning, that if you want to go to the atmosphere, it actually starts with the soil. And with you regenerate the soil and the way that we grow and the way that we raise and grow our food, seems like the rest of things start to take care of itself. But it's our responsibility as the stewards of that land to help find those systems. And so it's really, really cool to bring those two together. As you think about what you're doing and Verterra and the growth and vision of Verterra, what is that? What do you hope to see happen here in the next 5 years?
Great question again. So as we look out just over the short-term future, the growth aspirations of the Soil Center with Royal Family Farms are enormous. I mean, the amount of soil composted blend that would be required to completely mitigate the use of any and all synthetics is enormous. And so we're very focused on driving as much volume as we can in that Tri-City area, with kind of a focus on Royal Family Farms and the full reach of all of their operations. When we look beyond that, we've got already a dozen or so different sites located kind of across the country, where we've got where we've identified feedstocks, which is what you call kind of the source biomass material. And so we've identified at least a dozen different locations across the country where we have access to huge volumes of wood waste that would have otherwise been burnt, buried, put into landfills, done, used in very destructive ways for the climate and for the atmosphere, and then marrying that with locations that can actually put to good use this biochar material. We just were at Climate Week last week in New York for a full week, and we spent a week going from seminar to seminar. Biochar is kind of a leading way of doing what they call CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal, and it's one of the most effective ways to remove carbon dioxide from the planet. And the use cases around how biochar is being discussed to be utilized is almost endless. They're starting to talk about using it in concrete, which is probably about 10% of the carbon dioxide on the planet comes from the use of and the creation of concrete. So they're talking about blending it into concrete to reduce and mitigate CO2 from that process. They're talking about using it in asphalt and roads, water purification. So, to answer your question very specifically, we're focused on sites where we have large quantities of feedstock, large use case for the biochar, and particularly any case where we can use it in agricultural operations, dairy operations, farming operations, to once again be very focused on the way that it helps rejuvenate soil and therefore feeding the way that the food gets grown is something that we're very focused on.
Beautiful, amazing. And why blockchain? So you're doing all of these amazing things. You're making the world a better place. When you looked, and as we've met, where do you see blockchain playing a role, and why do you think it matters?
Yeah, a few different things. Number one, the part that we haven't spoken a lot about is when you go through this process of creating biochar, for every 1 ton of biochar, you create carbon credits. And depending on how far away you're pulling your feedstock from and how far away you're using the biochar, you run a calculation of how many of these credits you produce. But on average, it's between 2 and 3 credits for every 1 ton of biochar that's produced. And those credits can then be sold and traded and moved around the world to offset companies' CO2 emissions. And the reason that I think the blockchain plays an enormously significant role in this is because as most companies are starting to become more and more focused on their carbon footprint, what they're doing to mitigate their carbon footprint, the things they're doing to reduce their carbon footprint and offset their carbon footprint. Carbon credits, carbon offsets are becoming more and more relevant. And it's one thing to go deep down into the Amazon rainforest and buy a carbon credit and say that that carbon credit is mitigating the CO2 that I'm creating at my restaurant. And it's very difficult to create a strong correlation as to why those things have a tie. The food that gets produced, that gets shipped to my restaurant and sold in my restaurant, there's an enormous tie about the carbon footprint that it takes to run a restaurant, or the carbon footprint that it takes to run a shop or a small business. And so the closer to home that you can create these offsets and tie them back to the actual businesses or the things that are creating the carbon in the first place, the more relevance you have. And so if a farming operation is producing a tremendous amount of CO2 to run all the diesel tractors, to run all the operations, to do everything that it takes to run the farm, and you can actually change those behaviors and create carbon credits inside that farm and use those carbon credits to actually create carbon neutral products from the farm. So not only are they regenerative, but they're carbon neutral, or even in some cases carbon negative. And so it's a completely different story to buy a piece of steak that's sold in a restaurant that was grown regeneratively and also grown responsibly and carbon neutrally. And the blockchain and these initiatives in the farm create that ability for that to happen right there in situ with the actual product. The second reason I think it's really important is because carbon credits have had some tricky starts where the transparency hasn't been there. And so people have been buying carbon credits thinking that they're doing the right thing, thinking that it's having an enormous relevance in what they're doing, only to later find out that maybe there was some greenwashing occurring, or that things weren't actually happening the way that it was portrayed to them. The blockchain solves all of that. And so in the case of the biochar that we're producing up at Royal Family Farms, what's extremely important is knowing what we call the chain of custody. Where did that wood waste come from? It didn't come from somebody sneaking into the forest late at night trying to cut down some trees to create biochar because biochar has all this value. It truly is coming from wood waste from an orchard that no longer is producing because it's 50 years old. And the blockchain and Trifera and Vertera create that absoluteness where you cannot dispute where that wood waste came from. We're watching it from satellites, we're seeing it in the blockchain, and we're monitoring it all the way through the conversion process in these machines. And then the biochar itself, we're following that chain of custody clear through into the actual embedding into the soil, which is creating permanence. It's creating additionality. It's creating something that is indisputable. And the blockchain creates the mechanism for us to create that transparency and that absoluteness. That absoluteness then increases the value of the products that are coming out of that farm, as well as the credits, because they're fraud proof, basically. And that level of discipline and transparency makes all the difference in the world. And so that's why we're very focused on using the Grow blockchain as part of the initiatives that we're focused on.
I love it, and I think it's an interesting place that we live today, just in the world, because you have so much fraud in so many different ways, right? Speaking of integrity, and someone taught me the word, what we're actually building is a trustless system. And when I first heard the word trustless, my mind immediately went to, oh, that can't be trusted, but it's actually the exact opposite. You have a system that, because it ran through that system, because it had that discipline, it had the things that were used to put it in, you know it is what it says it is. And that's all we're trying to build. People ask me all the time, oh, are you just trying to be the next organic certification? Or are we trying to be the standard? It's like, well, what we're actually just trying to be is show you exactly what happened. And when we do that, the best will rise. And the best is what will be inside of our blockchain, because they will have met all of the standards that you just described to even have the ability to be on there and tracked and have their chain of custody be listed on it.
Yeah. The other thing that's really cool is, if anybody part of the community, has been a part of Farm Tracer, you go in there and you can see very specifically kind of the carbon footprint that went into growing those raising those beef products, and all of the different things that Austin's doing to kind of pull down that carbon footprint as part of that entire process. But he's not able to get all the way there, right? He's able to do things to continue to pull down the footprint and to mitigate it as much as possible, but he cannot get to a filet mignon that's 100% carbon neutral on its own. When you do these other things that are proactively capturing and securing and sequestering carbon, and you add them to the mix, not only can you get to neutrality, but you can get back to some level of, it's a negatively grown filet mignon. And that becomes an amazing part of the finishing of the story, because Austin's doing all kinds of things to reduce the things that are producing CO2. And then the things like biochar, the things like the worm farm, the things like reforestation and rock weathering, and all these different initiatives that are starting to get legs on the farm, they take you from, the almost to the finish line, over the finish line, into a completely neutral set of products. And they not only do they offset just the farming side of things, but they have the potential to offset all the downstream carbon implications, the shipping, the packaging, the disposal, the waste. And so we can get to a point in the not too distant future where you're not only offsetting the jug of milk, but you're offsetting everything that it took to move and transport and produce that jug of milk, all the way through the contemplation of the waste from that plastic jug into a landfill. And that becomes incredibly powerful, and it becomes available and potentially something that can be done through the blockchain.
I love it. And something that can just be tracked, can become trusted. We've talked even today, just in the last 30 minutes, about a myriad of ways that of the things that actually go into growing our food. Like, you talk about that milk, you talk about that piece of beef. People have no idea that there's poop, and then pee, and then worms, and then biochar, and then compost. We just think about the end product that ends up on our plate, but all of these things are happening, and we're at the onset of building a system that can provide decentralized transparency that's not governed by one regulatory body. It's actually governed by the users in a community that say, okay, we trust this system, we're willing to put in information or data, and then as a community, we can decide what are the best actions, and then reward those actions by buying the food, eating the food, rewarding the producer, and being the consumer that rewards that producer, all inside of a system that's run by just us as a community. And I think we're well on our way of having the railroad for a system that completely changes the way that we've been doing things, and can really turn around a lot of the negative things that I look at that have been done. Amazing things have been happening in the last century, but I think we're at a position where some of those things can be changed and improved and expanded upon.
I think the last point, so the case study at Royal is really amazing, but when you start to think about this on a global scale, you start to introduce all kinds of additional challenges that don't exist at Royal Family Farms. I mean, obviously, the use of extensive child labor is not happening at Royal Family Farms. I've seen Austin use his 6-year-old kid to go out there and help do some work, but that's not child labor.
Anytime my boy's there, I put him out there.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. But when you move into other parts of the world, like if you think about where all of the coffee comes from, or the cacao, or the palm oil, the different kinds of things that are being grown around the world, this is once again where Grow and the blockchain and Treefera have this enormously unique opportunity to create all of these additional levels of transparency into what's happening at a global level on supply chain items that are becoming really in focus for places like the EU and Canada and California, places that are actually putting laws in place that are going to prohibit the importation of products that cannot absolutely with certainty prove that no additional deforestation occurred as a result of growing of the cacao or growing of the coffee. And so when you partner up Treefera's capability of monitoring that almost from a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month perspective, and you put that transparency into someplace like the Grow blockchain, and you can prove exactly what was occurring in the coffee belt or down in Madagascar or over in Peru around what was happening with the creation of that coffee bean or that cacao. it's absolutely remarkable what can then start to be achieved. And once again, when you link that back end marketplace and you start to open up different supply chain channels for small growers and farmers to put their products in the hands of different consumers or users in a much more efficient way, with more marketability around the quality and what went into their growing, and why it's a superior product, or how it's been grown regeneratively or neutrally from a carbon perspective, that story will start to move the wealth back down to the farmers and the growers and the people that are actually putting in the bulk of the work in a very unique way. It will take a lot of the power out of the big guys, and it'll put it back in the hands of the actual people that are putting the work into producing these products. And so there again, this perfect unison between Trifera and little companies like Verterra and Grow that create that railroad are going to really change the way that this all works going forward.
I love it. I could not agree more. I've been talking about this for almost 2 years. And when I present the slides, one of the 4 slides is we have to make the producer the hero of the story again. We have lost that. And the ways that we are creating, the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, they're doing exactly that. They're putting the power back in the hands of the people that put the blood, sweat, and tears into often what is very overlooked from us as the consumer, and definitely the big middlemen that are controlling the system. This is the way to start giving power back to the people.
Yeah. As well as additional little revenue streams, like little farms down in Madagascar that can start creating carbon credits that didn't even know that carbon credits exist. Add those to the mixture of how that little farm is barely hanging on. It can change things completely. It can completely change the economic model of how some of those little farms operate. It can give them more control around who they source to, because maybe they now have 2 or 3 additional little revenue streams that they didn't have before, which takes the pressure off of selling their product only to the big guys. And so, yeah, I think it's going to enable things not only just from a sourcing perspective, but net new revenue stream kind of capabilities that didn't exist before as well.
I love it. I love it. All right, we're coming up here. Let's kind of look to wrap this up. You've got the community of node owners, which you are one of, and an active creator in the community of the things that we're building for and on the blockchain. Is there any last pieces that you want to say before we close it up?
I think the thing that I've enjoyed the most about Grow and my brief little journey with Grow is my own personal ability to make a difference, and making a difference in a number of different ways. I've personally chosen to make a difference by actually, going out in the field and taking orchard trees and turning them into biochar, and that's kind of one way. But the ability to make a difference by influencing the story, telling the story, introducing it to friends, introducing it to other growers. When we start bringing these beef products in, to also tell other restaurants in the area, this is, not only am I doing this, but you should do this. Like, as long as we're going to be bringing in truckloads of this, you should also partake in it as well. And that ability to really influence a story and have it make a difference in the overall way that this is unfolding, for me, is probably the most exciting thing of all. It's one thing, if you think about you're a stockholder in General Electric. I have zero ability to influence the share price of General Electric. I have zero ability to influence what gets done at General Electric, the decisions they take, the businesses they invest in, where they grow, where they don't grow. In Grow, I have as much ability to influence it as anybody else. I mean, truly. I mean, if I want to make it my life's goal, I can have as much potential influence on Grow as all the other people. And so the ability to put into it as much as you want to get out of it has probably been the most exciting thing for me, is all, because the more I put into it, the more the community grows, the more the community grows, the more the use cases increase, the more the use cases increase, the more the token value goes up. And so I can really kind of lean in and have a direct correlated impact in the big picture story as part of a community that's the power of the decentralization. That's the power of Wright's big vision. Like, everybody has the ability to have a voice, and that for me makes all the difference.
That's a beautiful way to end, and exactly the ethos of what we are building. Every single piece of us with our own proof of action have the ability to influence this on an exponential scale by doing whatever we want, frankly, right? And so what comes to my mind is some of the ways that really move things forward for the mission that we have is one, little things like listening to this podcast. If you have made it to this, share this with 5 people. If we have 100 people share this with 5 people, all of a sudden we have 500 people that have heard the story of what we're doing. So share this across platforms. Come in and join the Grow community by just setting up a Grow blockchain wallet and just holding that and having it there. And then if you want to actually be a part of owning and having consensus and voting on, just like Andy said, there's no CEO of the Grow blockchain. There's no board that decides what we do. It's us. It's community members that are actually running the nodes, running the processors that manage all of the data that we're putting in and building the core of the products that we've talked about today. And so if anything that we've said today has resonated with you and you want to have influence, you want to be a part of it, please like, share, comment, subscribe, reach out to us. And the more that we get, it doesn't take very many people. Very small hinges move big doors, and we're moving some pretty big doors already. Just the things we've talked about today, and there's much bigger things coming. I've gotten 3 text messages just as we've been recording on some calls that I need to make right now that are fairly exciting. So much more to come. Andy, thank you for taking your time, not only now to record this podcast to put out your story, but also for the day-to-day things that you're doing to nourish the world. And the more that we all do, the faster we get there. So thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Appreciate it.
Yep. See you guys. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Grow Renaissance podcast. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe this episode. Remember, it will take a community of us to do the best in the world and truly nourish not only ourselves, but the planet, the atmosphere, the soil, the plants, and the animals on it. So make sure you spread this message anywhere that you can.